Jennifer Sey, she's from Allentown, Pennsylvania, attends Central Catholic High there, and she's preparing to work the balance beam.
Jennifer just recently won our national championships to become our national champion. That was a flange position she held and then went into a front walkover. Straddle jump, very difficult move because you can't see the balance beam.
I hate that move. You used to do that in competition, Kathy, and every time you got to that part of your routine, I went, oh my gosh.
Oh, it's not that bad. 2 back handsprings into a layout somersault. She doesn't quite have the solid landings that we saw with the Soviets. She's actually moving quite well. Front mounter. As you can see, she's checking her balance just a little here and there. She needs a little more extension in her toe point to be absolutely perfect. Walkover, back handspring swing down. Tiny bit off, but not bad. Dismount, double twist. One little step. It's a pretty good exercise, but there are several deductions in there.
She's 17 years of age. Jennifer Sey from the United States.
Here's 2 back handsprings. Nice layout somersault.
Jennifer Sey of the United States, her score 9.25. We're in the second rotation, and we'll be back with more in just a moment.
Everybody, if you're listening to us, we're grateful that you're listening. Podcasting people, subscribe, like, and share. You know the deal there. My radio listeners, we're really growing. We're having a returning guest who we had on, I believe she was played on some of the radio stations you're listening to this on about 2 weeks ago, and we got extremely good feedback. I'm very happy to have her on, not to talk about any of the nonsense that happened in the past 3 years, but to talk about gymnastics and the travesties that have happened in that sport with sexual abuse, verbal abuse. We're going to go into all that in just a moment. She's wrote a book. It's called Chalked Up. And she's also wrote the book, which if you're listening to this on some of the stations, you may have heard that previous interview. It's Levi's Unbuttoned. The woke mob took my job and gave me my voice. Jennifer Sey, back on the program. I'm so excited to keep, having this conversation, just keeps going and going with you because there's so much to speak to you about. But thanks so much, Jennifer, for coming back on.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Rob.
All right, so let's kick this around. Tell the audience a little bit about how your journey started as a champion gymnast.
Sure. Well, I'm pretty old. So, I started gymnastics in the 70s, and it was just a few years after Title IX passed, which, if folks don't know, it's sort of most known for sort of equal opportunity in sports for women, but it's really tied to educational opportunities, because if there aren't, and I'm not a legal expert, but if if girls don't have the same opportunities, the same funding at the high school and college level for sports, they're actually also missing out on educational opportunities. So it's rooted in that. And that passed in 1972. I started gymnastics just 2 or 3 years after that, when I was about 5 or 6 years old. And at the time, it's kind of hard to imagine now because girls play all the same sports boys do, right? Like my daughter plays soccer and she plays basketball. She's only 6, but at the time it was sort of just getting started. So if you were a little girl that was very active and kind of busy and athletic, there weren't that many options, but gymnastics was definitely one of them. In 1976, Nadia Comaneci won the Olympics. She got perfect 10s. The scoreboards didn't even know how to handle that. There was no way to reflect a 10. They had to flash a 1.0 because there was no such thing. No one had ever gotten a 10 before. She was only 14 years old at the time, so she was herself a little girl, and that really resonated with girls across the country. So I was already taking classes, but just flocked to the gym. Girls across the country flocked to the gym. Gyms opened up across the country because there was, financial opportunity, and I just loved it. I mean, gymnastics is really fun when you're a kid. You flip around and you get to fly through the air. And I advanced very quickly. By the time I was 7 years old, I started competing. I'd made the team at my local club. And by the time I was, I think, 10, I made my first national team.
Wow.
So it went really, really fast. I was spending, even at about 7, 8 years old, probably 20 hours a week, which is a lot. And by the time I was, I think about 14, I moved to a club in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I lived in New Jersey at the time, but it was one of the best clubs in the country. It was called the Parkettes. It still exists today. They're under investigation for emotional and physical abuse of athletes, which has been their practice for 50 years that they've been in business. And this was just sort of standard operating procedure. But it was one of the best gyms in the country. And even though I was already on the national team, I really wanted to break into like the top 10 or the top 6, which I wasn't. I think I was ranked 12th at the time. Because the top 10 and the top 6, those are the kids that go to world championships. Those are kids that make the Olympics. And so, I wanted to get that next level up. So, I had come from a gym with a really kind coach who believed in sports as a way to kind of develop character for young girls. That was not the case at my new gym. They believed in just basically like beating performance out of you. And it was a very bullying and abusive environment. We were fat shamed. Our weight was announced on the loudspeaker. We were told, lose 3 pounds or 5 pounds by tomorrow. I don't care how you do it. And keep in mind, we were already, 95 pounds with 2% body fat. We were forced to train on really serious injury. I trained on a broken ankle for 2 years. I was shot up with cortisone every 2 weeks so I could keep going, or every 4 weeks. Without parental consent, the doctor would just come to the gym and do it. I could go on and on. So the emotional and physical abuse was just rampant, but it was sort of normal. Like, I didn't know that's how it was done, and no one complained. We were afraid to complain because then you would get kicked out of the gym or you wouldn't make the team. And it was the same at the national level. So if you went to team training camps, the national team coach would, behave in much the same way. We also knew that sexual abuse was rampant. There were coaches we knew that you were to avoid. I was not sexually abused in the sport, but many, probably 20, 30% of the girls that I trained with, which is a ridiculously high number. And anyway, in 1986, I won the national championships. I was the U.S. champion, and that was just 9 months after I broke my femur at the World Championships. So clearly, I came back too quickly and ended up injuring myself because of that.
That was in Montreal, correct?
Yeah, I broke my leg in Montreal in the last event at Worlds. Everybody thought I was done forever. I thought I was done forever, but I just went right back to the gym as soon as I got home, and I trained in a full leg cast, believe it or not. Came back 9 months later and won USAs. And at this point, I was sort of disintegrating, emotionally, physically. I was training on that broken ankle. The femur wasn't quite right. I was 17 years old and really just falling apart. That very night when I won, I thought I should walk away now because I'm at the top of my game and things are getting bad. And I have 2 years left till the Olympics, which doesn't seem that long, but when you're 17 and completely imploding, it's a pretty long time. And I was training 8 to 10 hours a day, just, abused all the time. Anyway, so cut to, I didn't quit because nobody has the good sense to quit at the top. I kept training. But ultimately did pretty much fall apart and quit about 2 or 3 months before the Olympic trials in 1988, or I should say I retired. That did not go over well with my coaches or my parents, and had a long sort of journey to, repair things with my parents, who had given up a lot for me. I hadn't ever repaired things with my coaches, but 20 years later, I continued to suffer the repercussions of the abuse, and I wrote the book that you mentioned, Chalked Up, and it was the first person account of the cruelty and abusiveness in the sport. And the sport and the Olympic Committee did not take kindly, nor did the athletes, interestingly, who had suffered the same sort of training restrictions, environment, abuse. It was not done. You supported the party line. The party line was shiny, happy little girls bouncing around and having fun. And that's how they generated sponsorship dollars. So it took about 10 years for me to be redeemed from exposing the actuality of what the training environment is like.
You're redeemed, but then you were outsourced again with the COVID-19
Well,
issues.
it was a very brief redemption. I always say that I had about 5 minutes. So, in 2016, Larry Nasser, if your listeners don't know who that is, he was the coach or the doctor for Team USA Gymnastics for 30 years, and he sexually abused over 500 young athletes. That came out in 2016 because a few very brave women came forward, and in 2018, he went to prison for life. That kind of hit on everything that I had said in the book, that, sexual abuse was rampant. Emotional and physical abuse is what sort of primes the kids for the sexual abuse, because they're so beaten down. They don't know up from down. They don't know, because if you think that the way you're being treated is normal, but you're suffering, you think there's something wrong with you. So then if you go, like, I'll give you an example. If you are starving because you haven't eaten in 4 days, which was pretty typical for me, and your coach is screaming at you that you're a fat pig, then it's very confusing, right? If you are being screamed at that you're a lazy piece of garbage, but you're dragging a broken ankle around trying to work out for 10 hours a day, that's confusing. And no one's challenging them. So you think it's you, and you feel shame that you're not able to kind of overcome what you need to. And so I can only imagine for a child that disoriented in the world, if they go into a doctor's office, a very well-respected doctor, and he says, this is medical treatment, and it's actually sexual abuse, that you don't say anything because you already think you're wrong about everything, So that kind of blew the lid off things. And all of a sudden, all the people that said I was a grifter and a liar said, oh, Jen was right, and we stood by her the whole time. And then, of course, I blew it about 18 months later because I started my COVID dissenting. So they all hated me again.
Well, you were right on both fronts, whether it was gymnastics or COVID-19. If people want to listen to that interview on COVID-19, we do have that in the previous episode, so definitely check that out. I do want to go backtrack into this, Jennifer, with the ankle issue. And I know you're still having issues on that ankle to this day as far as issues. And they said the only way to cure it is you have to have that redone. And I know in previous interviews I've heard you speak about this, that it's not a knee, it's not a hip, it's a totally different procedure, and it's not as well done as those other procedures are.
That's right.
Isn't that kind of like, for a doctor to do that and shoot a kid up at the age of whatever it was, 6 to 10 to even 12, 14, that doesn't seem like that's legal.
Well, so I was getting the cortisone shot starting at about 16. And you're never supposed to get more than 2 or 3.
Right.
It's not good for you, corticosteroids. And I mean, I don't remember exactly how many I had, but at least 10. I mean, I'm sure at least 10, just right into the ankle. And it was, if you saw the ankle, if you saw it now, you would be a little repulsed. But back then it was worse. It was like the size of a grapefruit. It was purple. Like clearly there was something wrong. But the doctor would look at it and say, oh, it seemed fine. Here, get back out there. And the coaches endorsed it. At a certain point, I was 18 and still doing it. So I guess I could give my own approval. But I know they started before that. He would come to the gym with a black bag and, bunch of cortisone and shoot us all up. No, I don't think it probably was legal. But this was 1987. I don't know if anybody cared. Things were a little different then. Although who knows, now schools can, dole out the hormone treatments without parental notification. So I don't know what's legal and what's not. This was definitely, poor medical practice at the very least. And, it's interesting because the doctor that did it, he was one of the very first doctors to actually use the blood doping in cycling. And if your listeners don't know what that is,
right?
Yeah, the velodrome. So the indoor cycling and the velodrome, there was a national training center in Allentown, and he was he was the doctor for the national cycling team, and he experimented with blood doping, which is a little different than Armstrong, although he might have done that too, because it wasn't drugs. It was actually I'm going to get the sort of medical terminology wrong, but basically more blood in the athlete's system allows them to sort of oxygenate more and have more endurance. And it's not as detectable because it's blood. It's not drugs. It's illegal still. You're not allowed to do it, but no one had thought of it before. So this doctor was not very ethical, obviously.
You know, when we talk about the eating disorders, I know you just brought it up on, as you were speaking, you didn't specifically say eating disorders, but I'm sure in that kind of sport, there were eating disorders. I dated a girl in college that was anorexic. And as a man, it's very hard to speak to a woman or anybody for that matter that has, those sort of disorders, bulimia, anorexia. I was also worked at a ballet school, not because I do ballet, because I was working as a teacher in residence life, and the kids were staying there, and I was facilitating them in that aspect. But they asked me to talk to a group of girls about eating, and I said, "I'm a guy. What the hell am I supposed to say?" But regardless of that, go into gymnastics and. As far as, they're telling you you're weighing 98, 100 pounds, which is skinny as a rail, and they're saying you're fat. And then this could create problems not only in gymnastics while you're competing, but after with the mental health issues of self-esteem and eating disorders. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You got it exactly right. And, the 80s is when people first started to understand eating disorders. I think the understanding is, much deeper now. Mine was instigated sort of much differently than I think a normal kid's, right? Because I actually had coaches screaming at me that I needed to weigh less by any means necessary. I mean, they were basically saying, throw up or take laxatives or run around in a saran wrap sweatsuit for 3 hours to lose the water weight, which is different for most kids. And it is largely young women. There are some young men that suffer from it, but I think it's over 90%, girls and women. For most of them, it's a way to sort of seek control when your life feels kind of out of control, to perhaps, delay maturing and, stay in adolescence a little bit longer, because you really do. I mean, I didn't get my period until I was 20 years old.
Wow.
Because if your body fat is low enough, you don't menstruate. So for a lot of kids, it's prevalent with sort of type A personalities, which I definitely am. But it's a way to manage anxiety, stress, the stress of growing up. For me, it was people telling me, you need to weigh 95 pounds. So I had a more sort of direct path to it. And the established body type was very, very skinny at the time. It's a little bit different now in gymnastics. A more muscular build is kind of the standard. Although I think that eating disorders are still pretty prevalent. So anyway, I had somebody screaming at me to, lose 5 pounds by tomorrow. So I did, but what I didn't understand is that I internalized all of that. Like, I thought if I just do this stuff while I'm in gymnastics, I'll be fine when I leave. But of course, that's not the case. To your point, you internalize it and you start to believe that you're worthless and that your value is only in how you look, and that if you don't maintain a certain weight, you have no value. And so as I left the sport, it didn't go away. And it took me, probably another 10 years to get past it, and it transitioned more to bulimia than anorexia. But the idea that, just the obsessive compulsive behaviors and counting calories and, weighing myself and managing my weight and, pushing every other thing out of my brain that I needed to do in life, that persisted well into my 20s, until eventually, honestly, and I think this is sort of unique, I was like, I'm done. This is stupid. Like, I'm out here claiming to be, I had a feminist awakening in college, like claiming to be a feminist. And yet for myself, I'm thinking my whole value is in a number on the scale. It's antithetical to what I believe. So I'm not doing this anymore. This is stupid.
I want to go into this because you were talking about the prancing around, these young women. A lot of them are extremely attractive. Do you feel like gymnastics has really become more sexualized than maybe even when you started?
That's an interesting question. like to look at it that way. Like there has been a push at certain points to say, oh, it's the uniforms or the costumes that's inviting, the male gaze, and they're inviting this sort of abuse. And I don't believe that. Like that's akin to, a young woman claiming that she was raped and the lawyers asking, well, what were you wearing? As if it's her fault. They're little girls. It's the uniform. It's the required outfit. You don't want lots of stuff kind of, hanging around to get caught on the bars and stuff. I mean, I will say at the college level, the dance moves, everything, it's more sort of in line with the culture now. So you will see sort of more, a little bit sexier, kind of derived from maybe hip hop dance and that kind of thing. But I look at it and I think they're having a lot of fun, and I actually really appreciate that those girls are having fun. I mean, nobody's saying male wrestlers shouldn't wear those uniforms because they're inviting sexual abuse, are they?
That's fair. I think it's just that, again, the sex sells topic. I do see where you're going with the male wrestlers and stuff like that, but we go on Instagram, and as a young guy myself that's, only 30, I go on Instagram and I, immediately you got the third girl in the thong bikini. I mean, this is totally obviously different than what they're wearing in gymnastics. They're not wearing that, but I feel like, I talk to men all the time. Obviously, they're my friends. And if we bring up gymnastics, they're going, just to bring up some of the people in the past. Nastia Lukin. Yeah, she's hot. They're watching because of that. And I'm just being truthful.
Interesting. No, it's good to know. I don't talk to folks that say that, but yeah.
Allie Raceman, you know what I mean?
Yeah, they're both very beautiful. I agree.
Yes. Yeah, and I'm not, trying to be disrespectful to them. I'm just bringing those two people out. That was when I first kind of started really watching the Olympics, was in 2008. And that was that Nastia Lukin phase.
Yeah, Nastia and Shawn Johnson. Yeah.
Right, Shauna Johnson, right. Yeah, right. When they were kicking
I think,
butt.
though, what you see Nastia, presenting on social media now as an adult 30-year-old woman is not the same as what, she was doing as a world-class athlete, Olympic gold medalist in 2008. Is she very beautiful? Absolutely. I don't know what's to be done about that when she's competing. I mean, there was nothing, I've seen her routines, there was nothing particularly sexualized about her routines. It's just that she was a beautiful young girl.
The way, sorry to interrupt, Jennifer. I think it's just the way that men think. They see a good look. Yeah, you know what I'm saying? That's what I'm saying.
I do.
We talked about this in, with soccer people that I've interviewed, professional soccer players that are women. And we're saying, like an Alex Morgan, she's not wearing anything sexualized, but she's good looking, and men are going to the games. Let's be honest. They're going to watch her because she's attractive, not because they think she's a good soccer player. I'm not trying to be sexist on that.
No, I hear you. And you know what? I'm not here to thought police anyone. So what if you think she's attractive? As long as you don't act on it and sort of engage in sort of harassment and sexual violence, who cares? You're allowed to think anyone's attractive.
Is that good for the sport that they're getting men to watch because they're advertising these women not just as good athletes, but as attractive women? It's sad. I mean, this is the way our culture is. Sex sells. It's sad to say this. It's not about how good of an athlete you are. It's if you're pretty or you're good looking and you're a good athlete.
Yeah. I mean, I think the way the sport was sort of billed and marketed back in my day was sort of less, it was younger. There was a belief actually that you had this narrow window of opportunity, and it was very, very young. Like you pretty much figured you were done at 17 or 18. Whereas the last Olympics, I think half the team was over 20 or 21, not old, but a more mature, woman, really, which I think is actually good for the sport, because there's all kinds of problems that come from that narrow window of opportunity, like going back too soon when you're injured. Like if you let your injuries hit you, we thought you couldn't miss a season. You might only have 3 or 4. So you certainly didn't pause to go back if you had an injury, which was what happened with me. So now if we believe that they have a longer lifespan in the sport, they can actually let their injuries heal. And I also think a young woman, an adult, is more inclined to reject abusive coaching practices than a young girl who wants to please. So I think the sport was marketed back in the day really as sort of shiny, happy little girls prancing around. That's what made it sort of, they were like sparkly little unicorns, and the notion that they were being abused physically, emotionally, and sexually by officers of the sport, national team coaches. The Olympic team coach is now barred from the sport. The Olympic team coach from 1984, his name is Don Peters, because he raped several athletes. If that was exposed, it punctures, it just fractures the entire image of the sport. They're not happy little pixies. They're abused young girls. That's horrible. Right. So now, and it's interesting you mentioned this, women's gymnastics is really the only well-watched sport for women. And it's only well-watched at the Olympics. It's the most watched sport in the Summer Olympics every year because it's kind of spectacular. Let's be honest. Like, what they can do is spectacular. I do still think it's mostly women watching it. A lot of gay guys really like gymnastics, but it's interesting. I hadn't really thought of it that straight men like to watch it because the girls are sort of attractive. But do you feel like it's marketed that way, or it's just sort of inherent in the fact that the uniform is a leotard and the girls are attractive?
I do agree with you with the college aspect of it, with the dancing and stuff, because, at University of Florida, which has a, phenomenal,
good team.
Pristine, college team, I've went to some of their meets in the past, and I think there's a lot of straight guys that go over there and they think the girls are attractive just to watch it. I don't know. Go ahead.
Don't you think girls go watch basketball because they think the guys are hot?
Yeah, I think so. That too. I've went on dates to basketball games with girls, but I've never went with like a girlfriend. Maybe I said that wrong. A girl that's a friend to a game and she's saying so and so is hot. I don't, really participate in that. But regardless, I
think a lot of women watch some men's sports because they think the athletes are attractive. I don't inherently have an issue with that. That's going to get me in trouble with someone, but who cares? I'm not here to police your thoughts. It's fine if men are attracted to attractive women of age, not young girls that are 13. The point is that doesn't mean you get to assault them, which I don't think most of the men you're talking about are doing that.
No.
So
Just to put an exclamation point on this, Jennifer, I'm talking more of the aspect, I've been out of college for, quite a few years now. But when I'm in college, and I talk to people about this, I'm sorry if they have a problem with it. But, I dated with a couple of girls in the past that were on the college soccer team with the college I went to. I went to the games not only because I like soccer, but because I was supporting them in the team. And I was friends with a lot of the girls on the team. But do I know guys there that didn't know a damn thing about soccer and they were just saying, hey, you got a bunch of hot girls in short shorts that are running after a ball. I want to watch it. Let's be real here. Let's stop trying to play the politically correct game. Not that you're playing it, but I'm just being truthful that, these guys don't give a damn about women's soccer. They're there to watch these girls. And maybe that's good. Maybe that, there's more people at the game. They'll be louder, regardless if they know what the hell is going on. It's good.
I also think, there was a time, and it still exists in the culture, that, men only found women attractive as sort of objects. And there was a very sort of specific body type that was, whatever, very curvy, big boobs. I don't have a problem if, like, these women are amazing physical specimens. They're like strong and athletic, and they're accomplished, and they're achieving something beyond the way they look on the field. If men think that's attractive, I think that's a win.
Yeah, I agree. I want to move back into, when you were in gymnastics in the late 70s and the early 80s, and that aspect. We talked about, the age difference now of the athletes then to now that we're competing. besides that, what are the other differences that you're seeing from when you competed to the competitions now?
Well, it's a great question. So I wrote my book in 2008, and the general sort of pushback from the gymnastics community was, well, that was 20 years ago. It's not like this anymore. And I was like, yeah, it is. I know it's exactly the same. It's just as abusive, if not worse, because at this point, the Carolis were running the national program. It's exactly the same. They wanted the public to believe that I was talking about old news, and I wasn't. And that all became clear with the Larry Nassar case and that breaking. And it has to be said that it wasn't just Larry Nassar, this sexual abuser, but he was endorsed by the Carolis, who were running the national team program, and they were incredibly emotionally and physically abusive. And there is plenty of evidence that they knew what he was doing and covered it up, and that others knew what he was doing, including the head of USAG, Steve Penny. So it was this just culture rife with abuse that allowed for him to get away with this for 30 years. So I would argue they're trying to change now because of that scandal. They had to. It was so horrific. It's so catastrophic, and it became linked in it was they wanted to brush it off, meaning USA Gymnastics, as one bad apple, but it became very clear that that was not the case, and he was only allowed to abuse for so long because the entire culture was abusive. And then I made a film in 2020 called Athlete A, the purpose of which you can watch on Netflix, everybody listening. It won an Emmy for Best Investigative Documentary, and it links the crimes of Larry Nassar to the abuse in the sport.
Sorry.
And so at that point, athletes around the world stood up and said, no more. We're not going to take it anymore. So there's been a grassroots movement in countries around the world led by athletes to say this style of coaching cannot stand. And, heads of gymnastics federations have been fired, and Safe Sport, which is an organization in the United States where you can report abusive practices, get so many calls and reports they can't even handle them all. So it's starting to change, but it's not there yet.
Okay, so let's get into Athlete A. Obviously, you produced this film.
Yeah.
This is a film that really busted everything open. I know your book busted a lot of it open, but this did the whole full thing as far as that, busting it all open. So let's kick into Athlete A. So as going into that, what gave you the confidence, to write Chalked Up, to produce Athlete A, when all these people that should have been supporting you in the sport basically were, again, and we talked about this in our last interview, with that cult-like, hysteria mindset that it's just that follow the leader. We cannot go against the grain. We cannot go against the establishment, whether they're wrong or right. We got to keep voting for them. We got to keep pushing for them.
Same mindset. You're totally right. You couldn't be more correct. And I think the other mindset within the sport, and the reason the athletes, came out against me when my book came out, is I also think that psychologically they really wanted to remember it as positive, because it's really painful once you dig into how abusive it was. And so I think there was like a wall up for a lot of athletes, and they wanted to just remember those perfect moments. Because once you go down the rabbit hole and really feel the pain of the abuse, it's like you got to do a lot of work and go to a lot of therapy to kind of figure it out. And so a lot of kids or young women just sort of blocked that. As far as the book, I don't know that I had confidence. It really was a mental exercise for myself to make sense of it all. Like, I didn't think I would get it published. I wasn't a writer. I wasn't a famous gymnast, even though I was the 1986 national champion. I wasn't Allie Raisman or Simone Biles. And so I knew that I had to write a high quality book that would be of interest. So it was really me just needing to kind of make sense of it all, because 20 years later, I was still struggling with it. It was like an exercise in recovery, Then the book came out, and I really went into self-protection mode because the blowback was so harsh. And I would say things like, I've seen some of my old interviews, oh, this is not an indictment of the sport. This is just my personal experience. That was false. It was an indictment of the sport. It was my personal experience as illustrative of the total experience. But I got more confident with the more interviews I did, because their pushback was so intense. It made me know that I needed to stand up for the truth even more. And then Dominique Moceanu, who was a member of the 1996 Olympic team, wrote her book about a year and a half after mine. And she said all the same things I did. And they couldn't criticize her as a shitty gymnast, which was one of the criticisms I got, which is so stupid, because she was an Olympic gold medalist. So suddenly now we could stand together. And I think we both got stronger and more confident in saying this needs to change. By the time I decided to make the movie, and I started it in 2018, I had fully found my voice, and I was fully confident that, you know, these practices needed to end, because so many young women had been harmed by Nasser and by many other coaches, because there was a whole series of events. There was a coach who got arrested. He was an Olympic level coach. He got arrested for emotional and physical abuse, and then he ended up killing himself before going into custody. The Crowleys were exposed. My old coaches are now under investigation. They're like 80 years old. Like, it just kept happening. And I was like, okay, I believe in storytelling. I think if we make a great film, it can really generate more support, you know, in exposing the horrific environment that these young athletes are training in. So I wrote the story, I found directors, and then we were off to the races. And I was able to get a lot of the young women that were abused by Nasser to participate, because they saw me as somebody who went first and was on their side. So they trusted me.